Since the beginning of time, mankind has been practicing worship in some form or another, the act of worship of some God, even the true God in the beginning of time. But we also read in the Bible even of pagan people who worship their gods in a variety of ways, and sometimes in ways that are quite despicable and abominable even. Today, many people have a false idea of what worship really is. It's one of those words that I like to talk about sometimes, or the concept anyway, of words that as soon as you hear them, or maybe even before you even register the word, in your mind, you've already understood or thought you understood what is being talked about. Words like faith and words like church and words like worship. Some people cheapen and shame the concept of worship by calling virtually anything worship. I've probably told you about the article that I once read or stumbled across somehow that was called 6 Ways to Worship While You're on Vacation or While on Vacation. And the whole point of the article was to give a list of things that you can do while you're on vacation that I guess you can check your mental box that you worshiped. In fact, if we want to get right down to it, the article was really about, here are some ways that you can worship without having to worship. That's the whole point, while you're on vacation. So who wants to go worship while they're on vacation? So here's some things. Some of those things were creating something. Arts and crafts is what we would call that. That's worship, they said. Or go on a nature walk. It's worship. Maybe any walk. I don't know if it has to be a nature walk according to them, but you could go on a city walk maybe, and it would, I don't know, maybe that would be worship too. But as we've been asking the question for the last several weeks, we will ask in connection with this: what does the Bible teach about worship? What does the Bible tell us about what worship is? How does it define worship? What does it say? This morning we'll take just a few minutes to examine it from a more philosophical perspective, for lack of a better word. Whereas next week, Lord willing, we'll look more practically, more specifically about what the Bible tells us, more practical aspect of worship and how it applies specifically to us today. What does the Bible teach about worship in general, we might say? Well, first of all, the Bible teaches that worship is done, something that's done to honor or glorify a higher being. That is as basic as I could imagine defining it. It is something that is done to honor a higher being in general. In the Bible, we read of people of the true God who worshiped the true God. More on that in just a minute. But we also read of people who were honoring some other god, Baal, or Asherah, or all these other gods maybe. Remember Paul in the city of Athens? It was said there were more gods in Athens than there were people. Not true, really, but, hyperbole. The city that never sleeps. Kind of the same kind of hyperbole. New York does sleep, but they say it never sleeps. City that has more gods than it does people. They were statues honoring all these gods, and they probably had things that they did to honor these gods. Worship is something. We probably could have started with that. Worship is something specific. It's an act. It is a dedicated thing that is done at a dedicated time. It's not anything like we just looked at, but it is a certain thing or things that done in order to honor or glorify a higher being, a God, if you will. 1 Chronicles 16, verse 29, ascribe to Jehovah the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship Jehovah in the splendor of holiness. Psalm 86, 9 says, all the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. That's a kind of worship, at least one aspect of worship, one element of worship. Psalm 95, 6 and 7, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before Jehovah, our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. That's almost a good description of the spirit and mentality of worship. Come and let us bow down and kneel before him, our Maker. We're bowing down. In fact, the word that's translated worship is sometimes defined as going prostrate or bowing down in reverence and awe. It is something that is done to honor or glorify a higher being. But number two, the Bible teaches us that worship is dictated by the object of that worship. Even among paganism, where their rituals of worship were often or always made by man, they were sometimes probably presented as being what that God wanted them to do. Otherwise, I can't imagine sacrificing one of my children to a god. It was told to the people that that's what that God wanted. One of the most abominable things you could ever imagine. And people did it. And even the people of Israel got sucked into that at one point in their history, and we're doing that. But worship in general is dictated by the object of that worship. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, first 4 verses, and then back again further down at the end of the chapter, says, these are the statutes and the ordinances which you shall observe to do in the land which Jehovah, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess it in all the days that you live upon the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places wherein the nations you shall dispossess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall hew down the graven images of their gods, and you shall destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship Jehovah your God in that way, he says in verse 4. And he says it again down in verse 31. He says, you shall not worship Jehovah your God in that way, which he, for every abomination to Jehovah which he hates, they have done unto their gods. You shall not worship me like that. You shall worship me like this, God says. Yes, that's an Old Testament passage, but it is a principle of God that is timeless. It transcends covenants. It transcends centuries. It transcends all time and place. God has a way that he demands to be worshiped, and that is how a person worships him. It's dictated by him, the object. When you do something for anybody, isn't it always about that person? Isn't that the whole point? You get somebody a present. You get them what they want. Of course, sometimes with human relationships and wanting it to be a surprise and things, you have to sometimes get them things that you think they will want, and you have to guess. But with God, you don't have to guess. You can guess, but you shouldn't, because worship is dictated by the object of that worship, and the object of that worship should be Jehovah God. John 4, 21 through 24 that we just read a second ago in our scripture reading. The hour is coming and now is here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, or in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. He wants people who are going to worship him in spirit and truth, the way that he has dictated. And again, can't overemphasize, even among paganism, The worship was supposedly whatever those gods wanted. That's just a simple principle of worship, or it used to be before people wrote articles about how you can worship in any way you could ever imagine. Going fishing, driving down the road. As long as you think about God, you've worshiped God. That's not true. Not according to the Bible. The Bible teaches that worship is dictated by the object of that worship. And number 3, the Bible teaches that all worship is not created equal. All worship is not created equal. There are certain things that make worship acceptable to God. And it is not simply that you really, really mean it. Going back to the analogy of getting somebody a present, we say it's the thought that counts, right? And that's true. That is true when it comes to what we do for other people and what they may do for us. It may be the most horrendous thing you've ever received from somebody. It may be dirty. It may be something, it's the only thing they had to give. I knew a man who, back in Kentucky, who was challenged, mentally challenged. He wanted to know everybody's birthday, and he was going to give you something on your birthday. And it was just whatever he could find, whatever he could get, whatever he had, which was hardly anything. He knew when the kid's birthday would be, or he would ask, and he wanted to find out, and he would give it. And it's like, that was special. The gift was utterly worthless. But the gift was special because of the thought. He wanted to do that. Now, the thought does count with God, but it's not all that counts. That's what the expression means. It's the thought that counts, not the gift. But with God, the thought does count. But what we're doing also counts. At least if we want it to be worship that is acceptable to Him. All worship is not created equal. It could be sincere, but not necessarily the same as any other kind of worship or other kinds of worship. There are different types of worship mentioned in the Bible. One of them is called vain worship. Jesus talked about vain worship. He quoted Isaiah. He talked about worship that was done maybe just going through the motions, or worship that was done following the traditions of men. He says, in vain they worship me. Just those words alone mean, they say a whole lot. Jesus says there is such a thing as worshiping God, and it meaning absolutely nothing to God. And if you're worshiping God, or if you're worshiping under the impression that it's for God, but it means nothing to God, then what in the world are you doing? Right? If God has nothing to do with it, then what are you doing? It's just for you at that point. This wasn't for God. If God thinks it's vain, so first of all, we need to understand there is such a thing as vain worship. Jesus said there is such a thing. It can be empty worship. It can be worshiping with unauthorized acts. 2 John 9 through 11 talks about not going on ahead and not abiding in the teaching of Christ, following the doctrines of men. Matthew 15, 7 through 9. Colossians 2:23, Paul talked about will worship. Could probably put that in there as another kind of worship that's under the heading of vain worship. Will worship, the worship that you make up for yourself. Number 2, ignorant worship. Paul talked about ignorant worship back in Athens again. When he was in Athens, he said, I saw this inscription called "To an Unknown God." Now he used that and he said, I want to tell you about that God that you don't know about. That was just a clever way for him to, use that thing that they knew to tell them about something they didn't know. But as far as it goes, he even implied you're worshiping the true God, but you just don't know it. That's him right there. He just, using that for his speech. But they were worshiping a God that was unknown. That's ignorance. Worshiping in ignorance, he says, in that very verse. What you worship in ignorance, I want to tell you about. Jesus told the woman at the well, you worship what you don't know. That's ignorant worship. But then there's also true worship. True worship. It's worship that is in spirit and truth, he says in the next verse, or in the next couple verses after he tells her, you worship in what you don't know. Then he says, the time is coming when true worshipers will come and worship. That's who the Father is seeking to worship him. Those who worship in spirit and truth. That is according to the example, the instruction, the pattern, according to the divine will. How do I know then if my worship is acceptable worship to God? How do I know if my worship is true worship? Maybe my worship is vain worship. What if my worship is ignorant worship? I want my worship to be true worship, but how do I know if it's true worship? Well, true worship, first of all, has to have the right object. Jehovah God, the one true and living God. If your worship is of some other God than Jehovah, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then your worship is not true worship. Everything else can be perfect, but if it's not the right object, it's not true worship. Exodus 34:14. You shall not worship any other God. And so on. Back in Athens again, Acts 17. All these thousands of gods or whatever. But there's only one God, he says. One God created the heavens and the earth. One God made man. One God. And he is going to be, not only was he the creator of the universe, he's also the judge of the world. And he will judge the world. One God has to have the right object. Number two, true worship has to have the right attitude. That's what it means when Jesus says, in spirit. You worship in spirit. Now that's the easy part to understand. Maybe not to do, but it's the easy part to understand in that verse. To worship in spirit means to worship sincerely. You do it reverently. You do it humbly. You do it because you want to do it. It flows from within. You mean it, in other words. You're not just checking the box. You're not doing something that you could do anytime or something that you just happen to be doing, but you call it worship and therefore it is worship to you. You don't do something in the world, but then you sprinkle God's name in there a few times and therefore it becomes worship. But it must have the right attitude. It's in spirit. It comes from the heart. It is done with a believing heart, with a humble and sincere heart, reverently for God. Like the Hebrews writer said in Hebrews 12:28, let us offer up acceptable worship with reverence and awe in light of this great kingdom that he's established and that we get to be a part of. Right object, right attitude, and true worship must be done in the right way. Now, I said in spirit was the easy part to understand in John 4:24 and 23 and 24, actually. This is the not so easy part for many people to understand. What does it mean to worship in truth? Well, some would say, well, it means that, you're doing it truly. You're sincere. Well, then, so Jesus said, true worshipers will worship the Father sincerely and sincerely. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? Now, sometimes the scriptures and the way they're written and communicated are intentionally redundant, but not like that. Do it sincerely, and make sure you're sincere. No, that's not redundant. That just makes no sense. He said, in spirit and truth. Sounds like there's a difference in those two things. I don't know what to do with the word "and," unless that's what it implies, is that there's two different things. To do it in spirit is to do it sincerely. Well, then what's it mean to do it in truth? Well, it would mean according to the truth. To do it truthfully, according to truth. Not truthfully in you, that's the spirit part. In spirit, from within you, but in truth, that's the outside part. Spirit inside, truth outside. How you do it from within, and what you're doing on the outside. These three things make up what true worship is. Not by the ideas or commands of men, not according to our own fancy or our own desire, or because it'll make the music sound better. By the way, which is very subjective in the first place. Worship should never be subjective. What sounds better is one of the most subjective things that there's ever been. I as a musician, I look up a lot of stuff about music, and I like to try to make. I like to try to be better at whatever I do. And you start looking at, especially in the guitar world and things like this, and what sounds better? Does this thing sound better if you get this, or does this sound better? And you've come to find out it's the most subjective thing in the whole world. There is no such thing as sounding better. It's about what sounds better to you. So some people say, well, we need to do this because it'll make our music sound better. Says who? It may make it sound better to you, but we're not here to worship you. We're here to worship God. What does God want? He wants true worshipers, those who worship Him in spirit and in truth. Nothing wrong with trying to make our musical worship better in the sense of singing together, and I want to try to, if I lead singing, to do it as well as I can. But when we start to branch out from the Word, to try to bring in things to make our worship better, in that sense, we're not worshiping in truth anymore. We're worshiping according to what we want, what I want. I would like to do this. This is better to me or for me. Or if we had this, then I could do that in the worship. The more things we have to do in worship, the more people we can have do stuff in worship, and so on and so forth. Like the parts in the children's play. Add as many parts as possible so every kid gets to have a part. Worship is not about us. True worship, that is. True worship has to have the right object, that's God. The right attitude, that's in spirit, sincerely, from the heart, reverently, humbly. And it has to be done in the right way, according to God's will. Based on these facts, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what about our worship? That's what we're here to do right now. It's probably a whole lot like it was last week, the week before that, the week before that. But that doesn't make it true. Just because it's the way we did it last week, just because it's the way we've done it since before you were born, or I was born, doesn't mean it's true. Even if it's true, doesn't mean it's true when I do it. Because I might be doing it while I'm thinking about lunch. I may be doing it while I'm thinking about what I'm going to do later today. I may be doing it thinking about how I can't wait for anything more than to get out of here. Well, then I'm not really there, am I? Not really in it. If I'm just checking a box, not really having the right attitude, the right spirit. But what about the right way? Like I said, Lord willing, next week, that's what we're going to focus on. What is the right way to worship? There is a right way. Jesus implied it right there, John 4:24, if nowhere else. Paul in Colossians 2:23 talked about the opposite, will worship. Self-made worship. Some translations have self-made instead of will. They have self-made religion or self-made worship. So that implies that there is a God-made worship. True worship implies that there's such a thing as false worship. So what is the right way to worship? We'll see more specifically next week. But as far as the heart, can I say that my worship is true? Am I worshiping from the heart? Am I truly sincere? Am I just coming in here like a zombie because my alarm went off this morning and this is what you're supposed to do on Sunday morning? Everybody knows that. You go to church on Sunday. Well, I say everybody. Not everybody anymore, but once upon a time, that's what you did on Sunday. You're supposed to. So I'm going to go. And I may go in my best suit or I may go in my pajamas. But I'm going to go because you're supposed to go. Well, if that's my attitude, then when I get here, what am I doing once I'm here? Am I involved? Am I truly invested in the worship? Am I truly from the heart glorifying God, honoring God with reverence and awe? You know what the best thing, what makes our worship more powerful and more sincere and reverent than anything is whenever the reverence that we have in worship, if we live that reverence every day of the week. Every day, that reverence shows itself, emanates from us. Then when we come here to worship the way God has intended for us to and instructed, it makes it all the more powerful. Not only for the people around us, but to God, because He knows who the phonies are. And I don't want to be one of those. I may trick you, but I can't trick Him. He knows if my reverence is sincere, if my worship is sincere. And you can know too. You may not know if mine is, but you can know if yours is. So let us all examine ourselves. Is our worship sincere in spirit, or am I going through the motions? If I am, it's vain, and I need to fix it. I may have worshiped the first half of this worship hour vainly, but from here on, it doesn't have to be that way. It can be sincere. It can be in spirit as well as in truth. Whatever your need may be, if you need to make things right with God, that's the first step. All worship is vain for those who are not in Christ, those who are not one of God's people. Worshiping God is what God's people do. It's a blessing of God's people. Anybody can do the same types of things, but God's people, those who are in Christ, who have obeyed the gospel, purified their souls in obedience to the truth, they have the privilege and blessing of coming before God in worship, just like with prayer, which is a part of worship. The blessing and privilege of God's people. If you're not one of God's people, we want to help you be one, become one. We want to help you to come to the truth, to come to Jesus.